Hi, I'm DJ Ware. On this episode of the Cyber Gives, I'm going to be continuing on with the Linux documentary. This time, instead of the past, we're going to be talking about the present day Linux. So stay tuned right after this. So as I said, we talked about we talked about the past, and the last time we talked about open source, the number of companies that were using Linux, and also the number of users as it grew up through 2001. So today we're gonna talk about where it is now, and then talk about some of the problems and some of the issues that are still in existence. But I always want to start with a quote, and this is Donald Knuth. He says, "I currently use Ubuntu Linux on a standalone laptop. It has no internet connection. I occasionally carry flash memory drives between this machine and the Macs that I use for network surfing and graphics, but I trust my family jewels only to Linux." Now, last time I asked you guys to come up with your list for the killer app because, as I said in the first video, it's the killer app that determines whether or not an operating system becomes popular or not. And I took your answers and I put them into the Wordy, and Proton is based on the number of occurrences of people saying, this is my killer app. It's the winner by far. And then that's followed by workflow. And a lot of you were talking about that Linux fits your personal way of doing your work better than any of the other operating systems, that you find it easier to implement what you like to do on the computer into Linux versus some other operating system. And finally, Docker, being third, runs the best for you on Linux versus trying to run it on a Mac or run it on Windows. So what do developers think about Linux? Do they use it more often? Well, as you would think, 61% use Windows. 47%, however, use Linux, and 44% use Mac OS, and then the rest fall into the noise, down around 1%. The Linux cloud, last time we talked about the killer app for Linux was the web server, but it's also today the cloud server. 90% of the servers that are in the cloud use Linux, including Azure Cloud from Microsoft. They're still based on Linux. And the Linux web, 96.3% of the web servers run Linux. Most of these are located in the United States, and the ones that are in the US support over 2 million websites. That's a lot of websites. The most common Linux variant or Linux distribution that you'll find on web servers is Ubuntu. That's followed by Debian and then by CentOS. Now, this information is from 2019. I don't know how this is going to shake out. There isn't a new version of this graph just yet. You'll notice that 39% of them don't show up, and that's because most of the web servers will protect the operating system, so there's no way to find out what it is. And that's a standard security practice, by the way. 100% of the top 500 fastest supercomputers worldwide run on Linux. Oak Ridge National Laboratories, their new Frontier system, has broken the exaflop record at 1.102 exaflops per second. This is the first time that's been done. This was announced by now it appeared in Top 500 on May 30th, 2020. I'm assuming that they broke that record sometime before that, but so the Frontier is made up of AMD EPYC processors. They're 64 core running at 2 gigahertz for a total of 8.7 million cores. You can imagine the cost of that machine. But that is a lot of CPUs in that machine. Frontier is also the first true exascale machine. So, I mean, there's some that have claimed that title, but then have been proven that they weren't really true exascale, but this one truly is. Linux Mobile, I know I'll probably catch heat for this, but 85% of the smartphones are Linux powered. So that's about 1.6 billion users at the time that this study was taken. which again was 2019. There isn't any newer studies that have been done. So hopefully, maybe we'll start getting some new information that's not quite as old. The other interesting thing is I recently heard one of the YouTubers say there was 300 active Linux distributions worldwide, and that was like last week. No, there's 600 active Linux distributions worldwide. And guess what? There's 500 more of them in the pipeline under development. As far as the Linux desktop is concerned, yeah, it's a minority player. 73% of the desktops are Windows, 15.3% are Mac, and a paltry 2.09% are Linux. Chrome OS has just slightly more than Linux does at 2.18%, and then the rest fall into a category of about 6.68% of the operating systems fall into those categories down there. So I read this article by Lee and Proven in the Register, and it's entitled, I think it's called The Sad State of Linux. And he asked this question: why are all the Linux desktop environments the same? He went through like GNOME and KDE and Mate and XFCE, LXQT, LXDE, even through some of the windowing environments. And, you know, they're all the same if you look at it from the standpoint of the 21 desktop environments that he was talking about. They all have a taskbar, they all have a start menu, they all have a system tray, they all have a file manager with a list of locations on the left and then the files on the right. And so they all look basically like Windows 95 user interfaces. And he's like, what is up with that? Why are all these exactly the same as far as their basic design is concerned? And so he goes on to say that for the mobile phones, for example, they use touchscreens and they have a completely different user interface from the desktop. So well, of course, yeah, they would, because you don't have keyboards there and a mouse. So yeah, you have to use your finger and you have to use swipe and gestures in order to get different functionality out of it. So yeah, it's going to be different. And then finally, he sums up by saying that he thought that re-implementing the same desktop model over and over again, it doesn't help anyone. It's a waste, a huge amount of talent and effort. So, one of the questions he asked is, why is this? So, right, let's go back to that. So where did all this mess come from? Why are all these the same? So back in about, I think this is 1982, Xerox Star, the group that did the Xerox Star, which was the first computer to have an actual graphical user interface. Now, there was some that had graphical displays way before this, but this is the first time anyone actually developed one for the actual computer itself and made it part of the operating system. So they designed a thing called the Xerox Human Interface Guidelines. In there, they specify, that what you're trying to do is to gain consistency. So if you have 15 different applications, the idea was at this time was human intuitive design. In other words, it didn't take a lot of training to get a user to up and running on a particular application, provided you had made them all look the same as far as your user interface is concerned. So that's where the menu bar came from. That's where the taskbar came from. That's how it started to develop, how you listed things and how you created property lists and entered data into the application to configure it. So, and how you showed devices on the desktop. The basic idea behind this was you had a number of users that were coming on for the first time to use a computer. Remember that most of the people back in the early 80s and even in the 70s, they didn't have computers at home. So yeah, it was just becoming a thing, and it was kind of slowly growing until the IBM PC came out, and then it started to grow a lot more. Yeah, you had You had Apple IIs and you had Radio Shack TRS-80s that were out there. You had Commodores and you had Atari machines. There was a whole bunch of others like Chromico and Ohio Scientific, but yeah, and the Sinclair showed up somewhere running that timeline too. But the idea here was that you had a plethora of interfaces for the application. Some of them used menus, some of them used drop-down lists, some of them used, you had to use the function keys, some of them you had to use the control keys in order to do certain things with the application. Xerox PARC, which was the inventor of all this user interface guidelines, they wanted to do away with that and make it more intuitive so that everything looked and was placed similarly on the machine, so a user, once they've learned one application, would not have any problems with the second one or the third one or the fourth one, other than navigating different menus for that particular application. Those designs go back as far as 1967. There was even some earlier than this. But in 1967, this is when Doug Engelbart made his Mother of All Demos video, which outlined the possibilities that you could achieve with a user with a graphical user interface and a mouse. He and Xerox Star saw that video and they incorporated a lot of the ideas, plus others they gathered from around the globe. But the idea was to emulate the physical desk and file cabinets because those would be the most common things that people would be familiar with. So if you had a metaphor of the desktop and a file cabinet, you could probably teach most people to use a computer system in probably a few hours. That was the thought. That's what I remember anyway. So one of the quotes that Douglas Engelbart, I love this quote. So, if ease of use, though, was the only requirement, everyone would still be riding tricycles, which is right. I mean, tricycles have their place, but they're not, and they are certainly easy to use, but they don't have the flexibility of a bicycle, a car, a truck, a bus, a train, a plane, right? But one of the other compelling things about these early designs was WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get. Up until this time, if you were doing any kind of document processing or word processing, you had to deal with your text intermingled with control characters in order to modify the behavior of the text. So you didn't really know what the document was going to look like until you sent it to a hard copy printer and had it printed out. What they didn't want to do that. Xerox on the Star machine, they wanted to present the document in its final form so that you had the fonts that was going to appear and the graphics placement and the formulas. It used math formulas and the headers and the bold and the italics. And they also invented something called copy-paste in order to allow you to move text from one document to another easily. So I would copy it to a buffer and then paste it back. We're all familiar with that today. It's probably second nature to most of you, but back then it was a pretty new concept. Nobody had thought about doing that before. So, and finally, in the realm of WYSIWYG, you wanted to provide, like I said, a consistent interface from one to another. You had window menus, dialog boxes, property lists. Yeah, even taskbars were in part of this. So Steve Jobs, where did all this come from? So Steve Jobs and Bill Gates went out to Xerox PARC. They went to see a demo of the Xerox Star. After that demo, they were both so impressed, they started working on their own versions of this amazing system that they had seen. Now, the Xerox Star, that machine you're talking, started at around $10,000 and went up. It went up from there. I remember seeing one of them in my entire life that was actually deployed and being used in human interface research. So, yeah, I never saw it actually used in a production setting, but I did see it in a human interface research part of the University of Michigan Business School that was using it. But, so, Jobs went back and he started working on the Apple Lisa, and then the Apple Macintosh to try to cost reduce what he had started. Gates went back and started working on Microsoft Windows 2.11. Those machines, both of them, had similar constructs. And in fact, they both went off to design their own versions of human interface guidelines. Linux didn't fall asleep on that either. If you go out to the GNOME developers site, you'll find one called the GNOME Human Interface Guidelines here, which parrot a lot of the things that were in the original Xerox PARC document. Apple has their own, by the way, and I think I said Microsoft has their own as well. KDE also has one, and they're all patterned after the Xerox PARC. So, yeah, so the all these designs came from them, and of course there were some modifications, and you'll find changes that they've made over time to make things a little easier, a little better. And in GNOME's case, some things that are not for the better. They've kind of departed a little bit from the standards and gone their own way to try. I think they've gone more overboard in terms of trying to simplify things. But anyway, but the answer to you, Liam, is the reason they all look the same is they're all based on the same human interface guidelines. What are some of the potential reasons why users do not choose Linux from others? And of course, the source of this is from the internet, so it has to be true, right? It's got to be true. Well, the first one is familiarity. So people are going to feel comfortable with a system they normally use. Do I disagree with that? No, I don't disagree with that at all. In fact, I think that's why the killer app is needed, is because generally that gets people off of their familiar. They'll stop worrying about the familiarity so much because they're willing to learn something new to get what they want. And that's why the killer app has always been the thing that drove new designs. Without the killer app, Mac would have gone nowhere. I mean, look at Lisa. Lisa went absolutely nowhere because it was banking on the user interface to make people come over and use it. Windows started out kind of that way, but Gates is no idiot. He figured out that, yeah, we have to have something here for them, some compelling reason for them to come. The other one is availability. So, yeah, it becomes pre-installed. With Linux on a PC or a laptop, that's going to make things easier for users. But my response is users still won't necessarily select one with running Linux without a killer app. There's still that problem that you need to get around. So the other one is software incompatibility. So this one I've heard a lot. The lack of industry standard applications like Adobe Photoshop is holding Linux back. My response is, I think you're missing the point. The point is, we don't want closed source and proprietary software. I think I made that point in the previous video. That isn't the reason why Linux exists. Linux exists to get rid of this stuff and get it out of our lives. We don't want corporate control over our software. We don't want people telling us how we're going to use our software and how it's going to look, how it's going to feel. That is the reason behind Linux, and I don't think you're ever going to get any traction for anybody from Linux to go over and beg Adobe or pay Adobe to port Photoshop onto Linux, because frankly, it is diametrically opposed to what Linux stands for. So be that as it may, I think that one will always be the case. By the way, one of the other things about that particular thing, about saying the lack of industry standard applications, that was an IBM FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt play back in the MS-DOS days. And they did that to prevent new hardware architectures from taking a market share away from IBM. There was a lot of machines that were in competitive markets against IBM PCs in the beginning. You had CPM 86. From Digital Research, you had a bunch of the early Chromico and Ataris and Apples and all those things that were competing, and IBM used that FUD in order to prevent them from gaining market share against them. Saying, well, if you don't have VisiCalc or you don't have Lotus 123, what are you going to do? Security. This one I found, this is kind of an interesting one. Where a particular person says security is acceptable on Linux, but we need to move away from external repositories, move past Xorg, and get faster release cycles. So The first thing is I've never seen a reason why we have to do any of this. More importantly, what does all that have to do with security? External repositories, how does that make my system more secure? And if I get rid of Xorg, yeah, okay, Xorg is invented backwards, and yeah, that is a security risk. But you can control that. And the other thing is faster release cycles. As I think it's more important that you make sure you have your security patches out in a reasonable amount of time versus having new code come out, because new code usually opens up additional vulnerabilities. At least that's always been my experience with it. And maybe you guys know something I don't, but it's always the changes that break the system. It's not code. Well, you can find the breakage in old code too, but more commonly you'll find things that are broken in the new parts of the code, because they just haven't had as much time being tested. So, and then this one, I always see these. I see these on YouTube, and I see them on websites too. These 5, 10, fill in a number here, are the best Linux distros of, and then 2020, 2021, 2022. Yeah, so I put together a video, it was a while back, but actually went through what you should do before you choose a Linux distro, because you can't let people like that tell you which ones to use, because they don't know what your workflow is. And some Linux distros are better than others depending upon your workflow. And besides, there are other things that you can go and look at. There are versions of Ubuntu that are designed, for example, audio and video. There's some that are designed for doing astronomy or science. There's some that are better for just doing home use. So you might want to go look at your workflow and then decide what your distro is going to be. I mean, one of the things that Linus Tech Tips did when he was looking for one that was for gaming is he listened to a bunch of people around him that suggested what to do, instead of looking at his workflow and looking at his hardware drivers and determining what he needed to go forward with. You know, the quickest way to get yourself in trouble is to put a distro on there that doesn't support your needs, right? And then I'm trying to bend the distro to make it work like I want it to work, and that's usually where you get into trouble. So, yeah, that's my response. I wouldn't create packages on Debian if I was a developer. I wouldn't use Debian if I was releasing to a Red Hat server. That just would make no sense. That's extra work, because the packages I'm going to develop that are going to get built on a Debian system are Debs, not RPMs. So, yeah, you can make it happen, but again, you're bending the distribution to your will, and that's where you're going to get into trouble. The next one is about this is, wouldn't it be better if you picked your distribution based on your workflow? For example, I'm a casual user. I'm just doing mostly web applications. Well, probably 90% of the distributions out there are probably going to fit your need. So it's a matter of picking one that you like, or maybe one that maybe you have some other things besides that using web applications that may drive your decision. For example, there's some for graphics designers that do mostly bitmap or vector graphics creation. What about 3D graphics designer? They have different needs. A developer who creates an app for an XYZ distribution, they're going to want to be closer to the hardware, right? A gamer who plays video games on a PC may elect not to go to Linux at all. They may run a dual boot system where they have some of the games running on Windows and some of the games running on Linux. I mean, that's a possibility. So you have to look at everything. You can't just pick a distro and say, oh, this is the best distro for you. The first thing is, those people have no idea what you're using it for. And that's what I've always said, is that you can't rely on that. That's why I don't sit down and go, this is the best distro that you'll ever find. I don't ever say that. All I'm doing is presenting some ideas for you to look at. That's it. This one is an important one, hardware driver compatibility. So yeah, my wife, I've heard this many times after I've done a distro review. I've tried this and I couldn't get my Wi-Fi to work. I couldn't get my Bluetooth to work. My sound card doesn't work. Well, yeah, those are all valid things. Yep, been there. I can tell you that from practical experience, your Wi-Fi driver is probably a Qualcomm, or your Bluetooth driver is probably a Qualcomm. Qualcomm is the most bizarre company in developing drivers. They don't pay attention to any kind of standardization for their drivers, and so each new piece of hardware is an opportunity to build a new driver to them, and it's just the most bizarre attitude toward how I've seen product development done that I've ever witnessed in all the years I have been in the workplace. So yeah, and my sound card doesn't work. So here's the difference between why you don't have problems on Windows and why you have problems on Linux. On Windows, Windows doesn't provide you with any hardware drivers whatsoever. Yeah, there's some that Windows sponsors, but they come from the vendor of the creator that manufactures that particular piece of hardware. So that the vendor has to develop the hardware drivers for Windows if they want to sell any copies of their particular hardware. If they don't have the drivers there, who's going to want to buy it? If it doesn't work, who would buy the thing? In Linux, we have a problem in that most of those hardware vendors, they don't want to bother with Linux. They don't want to give us the device drivers. So we have to reverse engineer that particular card. Somebody's got to go out and buy it. Somebody has to figure out how it works. What's the API look like? Hopefully they publish the API, but in most cases not, like NVIDIA, for example, although they are coming around a little bit. They're coming around a little bit. But the hardware developers seldom do it for us. So it takes a couple of years, maybe, to, if at all, to get a hardware driver that it's available for Linux. So if you're going out and buying the latest laptop, especially a laptop, and you're trying to get it to work with Linux, oh boy, good luck. There are some good laptops that you can go with that they do pay attention to Linux and they try to use hardware implementations that already have drivers. So yeah, and there's a number of them that do that. Lenovo does that on some of their models. Dell does that on some of their models. HP is starting to do more of that on some of their models. But if you're expecting Windows or Microsoft or Apple to build drivers for theirs, no. No, he chuckles. And then the final one, technical support. So yeah, technical support is kind of important. I purposely used this empty picture here because and a lot of times most of the official vendor support ones are generally empty. So yeah, official technical support from the OS vendor or the OEM. Yeah, you're supposedly paying for that, right? I mean, that's part of what your fees go to is support that. But in recent years, most of the corporations consider this a cost and have cut it back. So yeah, you're probably not going to reach the kind of people that you want and need to talk to, especially if it's a bug that you have discovered. So, but my favorite quote, this isn't mine, I wish it was, but most of the official ones give support like a hangman supports a rope. So yeah, I mean, it's a necessary thing, but they don't do it willingly. So you can purchase support from Ubuntu, or you can buy a Red Hat license if you wish. You know, it'd be nice if it was a pay-as-you-go model, but it doesn't seem to be that way right now. My other thought is, as far as community support is concerned, yeah, Linux has a real problem here. I mean, I personally, with all my years in this business, have heard this one, RTFM. Why didn't you RTFM? Or the second one, you're using the wrong distribution. Then they recommend that you use this one, which you'll run into a different set of problems. And so that's where I think a lot of the frustration builds with Linux and people end up giving up. Or worse yet, you're called an idiot and you're doing it wrong. Yeah, that was classic. And it's sad that they do that. But some people, you know, you get what you get. It's just reactions from human beings that maybe are just not so nice. The other one is there are some really good forums out there which do try to help users with questions. There's the Fedora's project docs, which has some good documentation. There's even some facts and troubleshooting guides in there. There is a Fedora community, but be careful. You'll run into the same people that I was just talking about over there. You'll run into that on any community forum. The Peppermint Linux folks, I have a limited amount of time over there, but they seem really nice. I legitimately think that they are honestly trying to help their users. Now, if you come to them with a Debian or an Ubuntu question, they might be able to answer it, but they're not. That's not really, you're not talking to people that are running Debian or Ubuntu. You're talking to people that are running Peppermint. So yeah, I mean, even though Peppermint is built off of Debian, but anyway, oh my God, Ubuntu is a pretty good source that you can find answers if you're running Ubuntu. The Arch Wiki is a good place to get some basic information. They don't always go into detail on exactly what to do to fix the problem, but they do. And the wikis, sometimes they do step by step, but there's some where they assume that you have some knowledge around that, and it just gives you some ideas of things to try. They're all great resources that'll help you with a problem. So, but you pays your money, you takes your chances with support. If you're going to community support, you remember that you're talking to people that are like you. They're hobbyists or enthusiasts. They're taking their time to answer your question. They're not people that are being paid, and they're not affiliated with the particular distro necessarily. They're just, like I said, they're people like you that are just willing to help other people. So don't yell at them unless you want to be yelled at in return. Don't yell at them because they're not responsible for the code. They might be, but you don't know that when you're talking to them. Some of them might be. So I think the next time we're going to talk about the future of Linux. So Linux market size worldwide is expected to reach 15.64 billion by 2027. That ain't nothing. That's a pretty sizable amount of change, enough to support many businesses in that space. So the pressures on Linux to bow more to the commercial side of things are probably just going to grow and become larger. So that's just what we're going to have to deal with. But I want to leave you with this quote. So your time is limited. Don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living the result of other people's thinking. In other words, what Steve was trying to tell you here is, hey, don't get trapped in Microsoft's way of thinking about how an operating system should work. Don't get trapped by Apple's vision of how they want you to provide data to them and feed their engines that they can then resell to other companies as ad revenue for them. Don't get trapped in all of that. Think about what you want and stop doing things for them. That's all I think he was really trying to say. And with that, I'm going to stop, and I hope you enjoyed this video today. And if you did, as usual, please like and subscribe, and hope to see you again in the next one. And bye for now.